Remember, the goal of this activity is to compare and contrast the Alien Sedition Acts to Donald Trump's policy of the travel ban. So keep that in mind as you're annotating this text. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 challenged the Bill of Rights, but ultimately led to a new American definition of freedom of speech and press. So what I would do is what I'm already thinking about here is just annotating the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights are the rights that are passed specifically to protect us from the government, right? And more specifically, freedom of speech and freedom of press. So I would make sure that, that's one thing I would annotate. Already in this title, already we could see that the Alien Sedition Acts is going to infringe on those Bill of Rights. When John Adams succeeded George Washington as president in 1797, the Federalist Party had controlled Congress and the rest of the national government from the beginning of the nation. Adams and the other Federalists believed that their political party was the government. The Federalists believed that once the people had elected their political leaders, no one should publicly criticize them. What I'm doing right now is I'm kind of thinking, looking at this paragraph, is what's the main idea? And what kind of stands out to me here is that you have one political party that's in power, which are the Federalists. And what they're doing now is they are going ahead and they feel as if no one should publicly criticize them, right? So I would go ahead and underline this statement right here. No one should publicly criticize them. This is important because we want to go ahead and take a look. Is this a violation of freedom of speech? The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, aimed to create a stable and secure country, safe for business and wealthy men of property. The opposition Democratic Republican Party was bitterly opposed to the Federalists. Led by Thomas Jefferson, it tended to represent poor farmers, craftsmen, and recent immigrants. The party was commonly referred to as the Republicans or Jeffersonians. It was the forerunner of today's Democratic Party. What I like to do when I read is I like to consider how is this similar to today. One of the things that this paragraph does do is it makes the connection to today. During this time in the 1800s, you have two political parties. Nowadays, same thing. We have a two-party system. Back then, it was Federalist and Democratic Republicans. Today, it is Democrats and Republicans. So those are some things that are worth annotating for. In foreign affairs, the Federalists detested the French Revolution of 1789 because it led to mob rule and confiscation of property. The Republicans supported the French Revolution for its democratic ideals. So something to consider in this paragraph right here is who supports and who does not support the French Revolution. Of course, looking at this, the Federalists are against the French Revolution. However, the Republicans are for it, right? So what I would go ahead and do right now is just looking at those first three paragraphs or first three sections is make those annotations, but also consider what questions might you want to ask in terms of discussion. The Alien Acts. So here's a subtitle. Remember, the goal is compare and contrast the Alien Sedition Acts to Trump's travel ban. So what I would do is just highlight and annotate certain aspects of the Alien Acts. Rumors of a French invasion and enemy spies frightened many Americans. President Adams warned that foreign influence within the United States was dangerous and must be exterminated. All right, and you notice exterminated is in quotes, right? So what this sentence is basically saying is that foreign influence, right, more specifically French, remember we're at war with the French, Adams is saying that all that influence should be exterminated because they could be spies. The Federalist majority in Congress quickly passed 4 laws in 1798 to make the United States more secure from alien foreign spies and domestic traitors. Most of these laws, however, were also intended to weaken Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. So a couple things that we want to look at. This kind of foreshadowing is going to talk about 4 laws, right? And these 4 laws, what they're going to do is to, of course, keep stability. Question that I would like you to consider, and this might be something that you could mention in our discussion, is it ever acceptable to limit individual rights, more specifically the Bill of Rights, in times of instability? So, for example, war. During this time, there was a good amount of war with us going against the French. The first law, the Naturalization Act, extended the time immigrants had to live in the United States to become citizens from 5 to 15 years. And this is one thing that's worth annotating, from 5 to 15 years. Since most immigrants favored the Republicans, delaying their citizenship would slow the growth of the Jefferson Party. So, one thing you might want to consider is why would they want to just to raise the immigration time from 5 to 14 years? Those are some things I'm keeping in mind as I'm annotating. The Alien Enemies Act provided that once war had been declared, all male citizens of an enemy nation could be arrested, detained, and deported. If war had broken out, this act could have expelled many of the estimated 25,000 French citizens when living in the United States. But the country did not go to war, and the law was never used. So this is a bold term. So one of the things that I'm looking at is this is probably something that I need to know, right? And the important thing you want to understand here, it says that all male citizens of an enemy nation could be arrested, detained, and deported. So that's part of the Alien Act, and something to consider. A question that might be worth asking, or you want to try to just you want to make sure that you're working with the text. Is it ever acceptable to arrest, detain, and deport someone of an enemy nation, even though they have not done anything wrong? The Alien and Friends Act authorized the president to deport non-citizen suspects, non-citizens suspected of plotting against the government during wartime or peacetime. This law could have resulted in the mass expulsion of new immigrants. This act was limited to 2 years, but no alien was ever deported under it. So something that's very important to consider is the definition of the Aliens Act. Should the president ever have the authority to deport any citizen suspected, deport any non-citizen suspected of plotting against the government during wartime or peacetime? Those are some things to look at in terms of justification. But you also want to consider during this time that we are at war with France, right? So John Adams wants to figure out did he have the right to do this? The fourth law was the Sedition Act. Its provisions seemed directly aimed at those who spoke out against the Federalists. In general, sedition means inciting others to resist or rebel against lawful authority. In England, seditious libel prohibited virtually any criticism of the king or his officials. English common law held that any spoken or written words that found fault with the king's government undermined the respect of the people for his authority. So this paragraph is very important here because what it does is it defines sedition. And sedition means inciting others to resist or rebel against lawful authority. And I want you to consider, I would annotate this is a good question. Looking at what I highlighted here what I'm thinking about is this a violation of our Bill of Rights, right? So to kind of sum things up here, I want to stop the video is what I would do is go ahead and make sure that you're able to analyze or annotate Naturalization Act, Alien Enemies and Alien Friends Act, and perhaps create a question, an open-ended question in terms of discussion for those three. Okay, but make sure you're also able to define them because remember our goal is compare and contrast the Alien Sedition Acts. The U.S. Sedition Act first outlawed conspiracies to oppose any measures or the measures of the government. Going further, the act made it illegal for anyone to express any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the president. Significantly, the act did not specifically protect the vice president, who of course was Jefferson. Additional language punished any spoken or published words that had bad intent to defame the government or to cause hatred of the people towards it. So this is very important because this paragraph defines a U.S. Sedition Act, so you need to make sure that you're able to do that and to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Basically, it's making it illegal for anyone to talk negatively about the Congress or the president. One thing that you want to make sure you understand is why not Thomas Jefferson, right? Who was the vice president? Why is that not illegal? These definitions of sedition were more specific than those found in English common law. Even so, they were still broad enough to punish anyone who criticized the federal government, its laws, or elected leaders. Unlike the English common law, the sedition allowed the truth of the matter to be defense. The act also left it to jury to decide if the defendant had bad intent. Penalties for different provisions of the law range from 6 months to 5 years in prison and fine up to $5,000. So this paragraph that we just read, what I would do is, if I was annotating, I'd annotate this punishment. It goes ahead and discusses the punishment for the sedition acts. And something I would consider is it against the Bill of Rights to punish someone for speaking negatively against the president during wartime? The Republican minority in Congress argued that sedition laws violated the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects freedom of speech and press. The Federalists countered by defining these freedoms in a narrow English manner. According to English law, freedom of speech and the press only applied before the expression of ideas. The government could not censor or stop anyone from expressing ideas. But after the words had been spoken or printed, the government could punish people if they had maliciously defamed the king or his government. All right. So this paragraph is very important, and what I would look at is, it's basically saying, according to English law, that the government does not have the right to suppress ideas or new ideas. Right? They can't stop someone from expressing it unless it's after the words have been spoken or printed. So in other words, I can't prevent you from saying something, right? However, what I can do is I can prevent that message from being distributed after it's spoken or printed. Something to consider. Is that fair? Is that constitutional? Yeah. The Federalist majority in Congress passed the Sedition Act, and President Adams signed it into law on July 4, 1798. It was set to expire on March 3rd, 1801, the last day of the first, and as it turned out, only the presidential term of John Adams. So this passes Congress, right? But something I would consider is, it's this paragraph is saying that this is John Adams' last term, so meaning that he probably was not that popular. So what I would do right now is unstop this reading through the section and just make sure that you're able to define. Remember, because our goal is compare and contrast the Alien Sedition Act to Trump's Act, and make sure that you're able to come up with 3 questions. The attack on Republicans. Secretary of State Timothy Pickering was in charge of enforcing the Alien Sedition Acts. He immediately began to read as many Republican newspapers as he could, looking for evidence of sedition against President Adams and Congress. In October 1798, a Vermont Republican Congressman, Matthew Lyon, became the first person to be put on trial under the Sedition Act. Like most Republicans, Lyon opposed going to war against France and objected to the land tax to pay for war reparations. Lynn wrote a letter published in a Republican newspaper criticizing Adams for a continued grasp for power. At several public meetings, he also read aloud a letter written by poet Joel Barlow, who jokingly wondered why Congress had not ordered Adams to a madhouse. So what we end up getting here, what you understand these 3 paragraphs is you have Timothy Pickering. He was in charge of enforcing the Alien Sedition Act. So you need to know what these acts mean, right? Because remember, that's our goal. We need to be able to compare this to John Adams and his act. We need to be able to compare it to Trump's Immigration Act. But this paragraph talks about is Timothy Pickering. It's his role to enforce it. However, you're also getting some congressmen now that are criticizing the president and the Congress, and they're going to be put to trial. Right. More specifically, we have Matthew Lyon, where he criticized Adams and he even read a poem, right, that would criticize Adams for saying that he should be in a madhouse. A federal grand jury indicted Lyon for intentionally stirring up hatred against Adams. Unable to find a defense attorney for his trial, Lyon defended himself. The U.S. Marshal, a Federalist appointee, assembled a jury from Vermont towns that were Federalist strongholds. Lyon attempted to prove the truth of the words he wrote and spoke. As permitted by the Sedition Act, this meant that the burden of proof was on him. Lyon had to prove that words in question were true rather than the prosecutor having to prove them false. Lyon also argued that he was only expressing his political opinions, which should not be subject to the truth test. So to sum up these last 2 paragraphs, what the jury is doing is they put Lyons on trial for criticizing Adams. What he needs to prove is what he said about Adams is actual truth, right? That it's, that there's fact from what he said. But of course, Lyons in his defense, he's saying he's only expressing his opinion, right? But he is being tried for the Alien Sedition Acts. A good question to kind of figure out here is, are his constitutional rights being violated? The jury found Lyons guilty of expressing seditious words with bad intent. The judge, also a Federalist, sentenced him to 4 months in jail and a $1,000 fine and court cost. This statement is very important because it addresses the punishment. Lyons ran for re-election to Congress from his jail cell and won. Vermont supporters petitioned President Adams to release and pardon him, but Adams refused. Something that's important looking at this sentence right here is, why do you think it is that Adams refused to let Lyons go? When Lyons was released from jail, he was welcomed as a hero in Vermont, his hometown. He was cheered along the route he took when he journeyed to Congress. Once Lyons returned to Congress, the Federalists tried to expel him as a convicted criminal, but his effort failed. 13 more indictments were brought under the Sedition Act, mostly against editors and publishers of Republican newspapers. Some Republican newspapers were forced to close down, and many others were too intimidated to criticize the government. So what this is basically saying here is, these last 4 paragraphs, is that, Lyons, although he was put in jail for the seditious acts, he was still very well liked by his home state. He was elected by Vermont. Again, something that's important to look at here was that that once Lyons returned to Congress, the Federalists tried to expel him as a convicted criminal, but this effort failed. So what these 3 paragraphs, what I want you to consider is, it's worth annotating here, is what was the purpose of the Sedition Act? Was it for political stability, or was it to bring anyone that's talking negatively about the president and that's a hazard to national security? Is it to punish them, right? So is it for political gain, or is it specifically for more to bring safety and security into our country? One Republican was convicted of sedition for publishing a pro-Jefferson campaign pamphlet that accused President Adams of appointing corrupt ideas and ambassadors. 2 men were found guilty of raising a liberty pole and putting a sign on it that said, "Downfall to the tyrants of America." Another was arrested but never tried for circulating a petition to repeal the Alien Sedition Act themselves. A drunk was fined $150 for insulting President Adams. So you need to understand this paragraph is how people that supported Thomas Jefferson were being punished for expressing their views. You need to be able to give evidence to support that in this paragraph. The most bizarre case, the Federalists in the U.S. Senate formed a special committee to investigate a Republican editor, William Duane. Republicans had leaked to him a Federalist proposal to change how presidential electoral votes were counted. Duane had printed a law and written editorials announcing it. When summoned to the Senate, he faced charges of writing false, scandalous, defamatory, and malicious assertions. He went into hiding and secretly continued writing for his newspaper. So I want you to consider looking at this last paragraph is, did William Duane do anything wrong? The covered government, the Senate thinks he did. What did he do? And I want you to consider is, was what he did wrong? All right, so I would pause it right here and make those annotations, as well as perhaps answer those questions as we read through it. A new definition of freedom of press. So this is very important because it sums up what the Alien Sedition Acts are. The Alien Sedition Acts provoked a debate between Republican and Federalist state legislators over freedom of speech and press. In a resolution he wrote for the Virginia legislature, James Addison argued the Sedition Act attacked the right of freely examining public characters and measures, and of free communication among people. In heavily Federalist Massachusetts, state legislators responded that a sedition law was wise and necessary to defend against secret attacks by foreign or domestic enemies. This paragraph is important. What I would do is go back and annotate this. Think about what was the purpose of these Alien Sedition Acts. The Federalists in Congress issued a report accepting the Old English Common Law definition of free speech and press. It argued that the First Amendment only stopped the government from censoring beforehand any speeches or writings. The government argued that Federalists should be able to protect itself from false and malicious words. Congressman John Nichols, a Republican from Virginia, challenged this Federalist view. He asserted that Americans must have a free flow of information to elect leaders and to judge them once they were in office. Nichols asked why government, which should be critically examined for its policies and decisions, should have the power to punish speakers and press for informing the voters. In the end, the people settled this debate in 1800 by electing Thomas Jefferson as president and a Republican majority of Congress. In his inaugural address, Jefferson confirmed a new definition of free speech and press as the right for Americans to think freely and to speak and write what they think. So something that you want to look at here is John Adams' definition of freedom of speech versus Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson will go ahead and beat John Adams in the next election. Okay? So what I would do right now is I would go back and kind of just, go back to our goal is be able to compare and contrast the Alien and Sedition Acts with Trump's immigration ban, right? So be able to define. I would give a nice, concise definition for what that Alien Sedition Acts, what it does, right? Okay, so let's go to our next reading. Remember, our goal is compare and contrast Trump's executive order, his travel ban, with the Alien Sedition Acts. In his work in his first week in office, and one of the things that you could do is also compare and contrast Trump to John Adams. In his first week in office, the U.S. President Donald J. Trump signed a flurry of executive orders addressing topics such as foreign aid, trade, healthcare, and the U.S.-Mexico border. So one thing is this term executive order, right? What this is, it's an order done by the president that does not necessarily need to be passed by Congress. So it's an action that he could put in place immediately. And it says so right here. An executive order is an order signed by the president that does not need to be approved by Congress. So very important. That's a need-to-know term. On January 27, 2017, Trump signed an executive order titled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States that restricted immigration to travel in the United States. Trump stated that the goal of this order is to protect the United States from terrorist attacks committed by foreigners. So what I would go ahead and do is already it defines what his executive order is. And one of the things that it does is it protects the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. I would stop and I'd kind of go back to my previous document and think, how is this similar or different so far to the Alien Sedition Acts? In the hours and days that followed, airports throughout the United States became scenes of confusion and protest. Airport officials detained travelers and thousands of demonstrators gathered to voice their opposition to the order. The executive order sparked strong reactions within the country around the world as individuals and government officials voiced concerns over the constitutionality of the order, the U.S. treatment of Muslims, and U.S. national security. So when Trump signs this executive order, what this paragraph is saying here, I think this is the most powerful statement. Airport officials detained travelers and thousands of demonstrators gathered to voice their opinions to this order. So what this means is that because he's banning travel and immigration from several countries, that if people that were traveling in the United States, right, or they were stuck in the airports and they were in one of these banned, from one of these banned countries, is they would now be stuck. How does the United States, or how does the executive order restrict travel to the United States? There are several components of the executive order. First, the order places several limitations on refugees coming in to the United States. Very important, I would highlight this, is you need to know what a refugee is. Refugees are individuals who have fled their home countries to escape conflict and persecution. So very important, I would annotate this, highlight it, is that refugees are people who are fleeing their country, and the reason why is because they're being persecuted. It could be because of religious freedom. It could be because there's a dictator, an authoritarian government that's in place. That's why they're moving or trying to go settle in another country. So this order suspends the U.S. refugee program from admitting refugees from anywhere in the world for 120 days and also prohibits the United States from accepting refugees from Syria indefinitely. What I would go ahead and do then is, after I'm done reading this paragraph, is you always want to make sure you understand who Syrians are, but as well as the situation. That's why this global refugee crisis section is right there. The order calls for the U.S. government to review its refugee admission process and consider additional measures to screen refugees for security threats. The order also decreases the number of refugees that the United States will admit in 2017 to 50,000 or less, President Obama had set the limit from 2017 at 110,000, while the limit for 2016 was 85,000. So this is very important because one of the things that it discusses is the changes between the Trump administration and the Obama administration in terms of the refugees, the amount that they're bringing in. I would make sure to annotate that. The executive order does not only restrict refugees, it also limits other types of immigrants and travelers. For example, the order prohibits citizens of 7 Muslim-majority countries, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, and Somalia, from coming to the United States for 90 days following the order. So one thing you understand is what the executive order does is it bans immigration from these countries, right? So, I mean, I think we're at a good spot. If you had any questions, this is a time you'd want to make sure that you write them down or ask them. What happened immediately after President Trump announced the executive order? Within hours of President Trump signing that executive order, travelers were detained at airports within the United States, and some were sent out of the country. Others were stopped in foreign airports and turned away when attempting to fly to the United States. Individuals who refused entry or detained included refugees from around the world, as well as citizens of the 7 countries listed in the executive order. This included individuals attending school or working in the United States, visitors, and green card holders. So main thing you want to understand is this paragraph is summing up the chaos that occurred as a result of the passing of the executive order. Social media was flooded with posts about the controversial executive order as individuals in the United States around the world shared their views. Protesters flocked to the airports throughout the country to denounce the order, while government officials support the executive orders. Others have called it for it to be overturned. This is a good point for you. You know, what's going on in my mind is keeping that goal. Remember, our goal is compare and contrast the Alien Sedition Acts to Trump's executive order, right? So what I would do is go back and see what similarities and differences there are, especially with this one talking about social media. How is that similar or different to the Alien Sedition Acts? On Saturday, January 8th, the day following the executive order, a federal judge in New York blocked part of the order, ruling that travelers must not be ejected from the United States. Federal judges in several other states issued similar rulings in the days that followed, some which also prohibited the detention of travelers. On Sunday, January 29, the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, announced that individuals from 7 countries who have green cards would be allowed to enter the United States going forward. On Monday, January 30, Acting Attorney General Sally Q. Yates issued a statement questioning the legality of the order. She announced that the Justice Department lawyers could not defend it. President Trump fired her that evening. So what this paragraph kind of represents is political chaos. What I would recommend is I'd go back to that other reading is, are there similarities or differences in terms of the chaos of the Alien Sedition Acts to that of Trump's travel ban? Since the country's founding people in the United States had debated that the U.S. immigration policy should be in the wake of President Trump's recent executive order, journalists, policymakers, and other individuals have referenced different immigration policies in the U.S. as a reference point for either defending or supporting the order. Something to consider here is, just in general, how is this already? I mean, people are criticizing, but at the same time, making connections to other immigration policies. How is this similar to John Adams? The refugee screening process. So this is very important because it explains how refugees are screened. Are they, to ensure that they are not a threat to society. While some people argue that a U.S. system for screening refugees is thorough, others fear that the system is not strong enough and that could allow terrorists to enter the country. Refugees are given the highest level of security screening of any travelers to the United States. After being registered and interviewed by the UN, the United Nations, and referred to the United States for resettlement, refugees go through an extensive process in order to be admitted to the country. The process often takes 2 years or longer. Refugees go through multiple rounds of background checks and interviews before being approved and admitted. A range of government agencies are involved in the screening of candidates, including the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department. In recent years, Syrian refugees have subjected to the additional security checks. In 2011, Obama called for additional review of Iraqi refugees who had been recently admitted to the country and those who were applying to enter. This did not ban Iraqi refugees, but slowed the process for 6 months. So something I would consider that making annotations right here is, what evidence does this author show on whether or not the screening process is strict or not strict enough, right? That would be a good question for discussion. How has the United States limited or banned immigration of certain groups in the past? What I would do is I would read this section, right? And because this section you should read it on your own. I'm going to actually skip through this. When I stop this video, I would go back and read it. But this is other instances in history where immigration has been banned, right? And that might be a good connection that you could make back to our goal. Compare and contrast John Adams' Alien Sedition Act to that of Trump's travel ban. Okay, so the last part, wrapping it up. How has the United States sought to limit discrimination in its immigration policy? While several U.S. policies have restricted immigration on certain groups, there have also been efforts to limit discrimination against those seeking to immigrate to the United States. For example, the passage of the Immigration of the Nationality Act of 1938 created new guidelines for issuing immigration visas. It banned discrimination based on race, sex, nationality, place of birth, or residence. So this is very important. I would annotate this. The Nationality Act of 1965. It created guidelines for issuing immigration visas. It banned discrimination based on race, sex, nationality, place, birth, or place of residence. I want you to consider this. Was the Alien Sedition Acts, did it go against the National Act of 1965? Also consider, does President Trump's travel ban go against the National Act of 1965? For the first time, U.S. immigration policy afforded immigrants from around the world more equal consideration for relocation to the United States. The act immediately boosted immigration for the nationalities that previously had been restricted. While previous policies had prioritized European immigration after the 1965 Act, Asian, Latin American, and African immigration increased. So something to consider. Once again, just annotating as well as asking question is, does the Nationality Act of 1965 go against, or does it support the Alien Sedition Acts as well as Trump's travel ban or his executive order, right? And then what I would then do is I would think, how similar or different are the Alien Sedition Acts as well as Trump's executive order? What questions remain regarding the recent executive order? The executive order remains a controversial topic that will continue to be debated among the public, within Congress, the courts, and the media. It poses numerous questions to be considered. For example, is the order legal according to U.S. and international law? How will it be carried out moving forward? Will it be expanded to other countries? Will it be effective in improving the security of the United States or provoke anti-American sentiment around the world? So these are all great discussion questions that we could discuss in our Harkness session, all right? So I'd go back and just make sure you read this section on how the United States limited or banned immigration of certain groups in the past. And then you remember, you want to be able to compare and contrast the Alien Sedition Acts and Trump's executive order, right? And then also create 5 questions for discussion.